Hey everybody, Amy here again with another Dueling Rabbits Productions video about my awesome Swedish Drawloom. Today's exciting topic, designing for the pattern shaft attachment. The pattern shafts are the beating heart of my Drawloom. I can use up to 50 of them to weave complex figurative damask patterns with simple lift plans and the minimum of design fuss. I can arrange the warp threads on my pattern shafts in an almost infinite number of ways. Here are 3 possibilities. The first is a straight threading, which allows me to treat each element in my design independently. As long as my piece isn't too wide, I can weave anything that I can draw on graph paper. The second arrangement is a single point threading. This gives me an axis of symmetry around which to work. The third option is my personal favorite and the one I use most often, a repeated point threading. This approach allows me to build up visually complex pictures like the one in the central panel of this piece. By combining different threadings in separate areas of the piece, I can create almost anything that I can imagine. Here, for example, there's a repeated point threading in the central panel, a straight threading in the side panel, and a single point threading in the borders here and here. Today, we are concentrating on designs using the repeated point threading. So let's look at the piece I'm currently working on. For reasons that I'm not going to go into, it's a representation of our upstairs master bathroom, and I hope you can see the different elements. For example, here's our soaking tub with our 2 cats, Jensen and Button, peering out of it because it's their favorite hiding place. Hot and cold taps, of course. There's a hand-woven rug in front of the dual vanity, which has drawers and 2 sinks on top. There's our commode with a roll of toilet paper hanging on the wall next to it. And there's the frosted glass window through which we can see the outside world. For our purposes today, we're going to ignore the checkerboard border here on the sides and across the bottom because that's designed separately. The picture is composed of white squares atop a blue background. We can see them singly here and here. By stacking the squares in columns or laying them beside one another in rows, we construct our design. Each square is 6 threads wide by 6 threads tall. In Drawloom weaving, we call these squares units. The central panel from here to here is 145 units wide. So let's break that down a little more. I don't have to think about those 145 units separately because of the symmetrical nature of the design. I think the first thing you'll notice is the repeats. Everything's repeated 4 times. There's 4 vanities, there's 4 rugs, there's 4 bathtubs if you consider that there's 3 plus 2 halves on either side. Not only are they repeats, but the repeats are perfectly symmetrical. They're built around turning points. If we just look at the unique features of this design, you'll see it's actually not many pixels to work with. There's a turning point there, and there's a turning point there. Altogether, that's 19 units if I were to count the columns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. That's all I really need to think about. If I flip those 19 units to the right, I get the rest of the bathtub like that. If I flip those 19 units to the left, I get the rest of the bathtub like that. And that's how the picture's constructed. Now, when I'm weaving, I don't have to worry about these flips or the repeats because the awesome powers of my pattern shafts take care of that for me. Here's how that translates into my pattern. If you look at this chart, You can see I've marked off rows 1 through 19. These represent the pattern shafts of my loom, with 1 being at the back and 19 being at the front. Shaft 1 and the units on it correspond to that first turning point. It's a single column of units, so that unit appears by itself. Similarly, shaft 19 corresponds to this left-hand turning point. Again, there's only 1 unit on it representing this single column. In between each turning point are the 17 remaining units of my design. Each repeat is 36 units wide. It starts here at my first turning point on shaft 1. That corresponds to the faucet on the bathtub. It continues all the way to the second turning point on shaft 19, the space between the tubs here. It then returns back through the shafts to shaft 2 to complete the repeat, which is there, 36 units. I repeat this threading 4 times across the pattern shafts at the back of my loom, and I add 1 extra unit for symmetry at the left-hand side of the piece, and that gives me the 145 units that we talked about earlier. What this means in practical terms is that every time I lift shaft 19, for example, the unit associated with that turning point is going to be lifted across all 4 repeats, like this. I'm going to raise shaft 19 now. Up it goes, and you can see that now I have 4 units raised, and those 4 units correspond to that turning point. If I want to lift the units on either side of that turning point, there's 1 unit on each side, I can lift shaft 18. That lifts 8 units, 1 on either side of each turning point, relating to those 2 units that are threaded there. Every time I lift the appropriate shafts, the units required to flip and repeat my design are raised. Before I go on to talk about how I took all this into account when I'm designing a lift plan, I'd like to say a little bit about the overall strategy for this piece. How did I decide how many repeats I wanted to thread, for example? Well, math was required, and these are the numbers that I had to think about. My chosen structure is 6-end irregular satin. The warp thread that I'm using is 32 cotton. I know from experience that when I'm using this structure and this warp, I have to slay my reed at 27 ends per centimeter. That gives me 27 threads per centimeter of width of cloth. You may remember that I said each unit was 6 threads wide. If I crunch all of those numbers together, I come up with 4.5 units per centimeter of width. Now, remember how I said that my central panel was 145 units wide? Well, that's no accident. I knew that I wanted the central panel to be something like 31, 32 centimeters wide, which was going to give me an overall piece of an agreeable size considering once I'd added the borders. 145 units at 4.5 units per centimeter gives me 32 centimeter wide piece. And if I take out my trusty tape measure and measure my central panel, I can see that it's about a little over 31 centimeters wide, which is acceptable given draw in. So now it's time for the big reveal. It may surprise you to see that the lift plan for the piece we've just been looking at is as simple as that. But it makes perfect sense if you remember that we're only designing for 19 units, 1 through 19. The pattern shafts will take care of the repeats and the mirroring all by themselves. So this is what we have: 19 columns, each representing pattern shaft. This column to the right is pattern shaft 1, that first turning point. This column on the left is the second turning point on shaft 19. We also have the 17 units on their shafts in the middle to play with. If we hold up a mirror, we can see what the bathtub will look like after it's woven. This entire bathtub is 36 units across. I have 4 of them marching across the width of the piece, plus 1 additional unit for symmetry on the left-hand side, giving me 145 units across the central panel. Common sense tells me if I also have 145 units going vertically, I will have a square when I'm finished weaving. I also knew when I started designing this thing that I wanted it to be symmetrical top to bottom, like that. I was going to weave up to the middle, turn around, reverse the pattern, and weave back out the other side. 145 divided by 2 is 72 plus 1, which is perfect. It gives me 72 rows to work with, plus 1 row, which is the turning point, in this case, the center of that mullioned window. Now, this is not exactly 73 units tall because I also had to think about borders and how they were going to work, but it's very close. Therefore, this is what I had to work with, a grid 19 squares wide by 73 or so squares tall. At this point in the process, having established my design parameters, I could have got myself a piece of graph paper, marked off a grid 19 by 73, taken a pencil and a mirror, and started filling in squares to come up with my design. That's how weavers of old did it, and many very fine weavers today still do. I like to get out my laptop, open a program, and use those for my designs. There are several software solutions for Drawloom weavers designing on their PCs or Macs. Fiberworks and WeavePoint, for example, are 2 programs meant specifically for users of multi-shaft looms. Many weavers use cross-stitch programs to automate mirroring and repeats, and with some tweaking, even Excel can be called into service. I use Fiberworks since it's what I already had on my MacBook when I started weaving on my Drawloom. Although not really intended for the purpose, it has all the features I need for my designs. As long as my lift plan is less than 64 units wide, I can design the whole piece in one file. So while I've been pontificating, I've set up my workspace in Fiberworks. Here's my grid, 19 by 73. You can ignore the tie-up box here. This is just a convenience to fool the program into thinking it's for Drawlooms. Up across the top are the 4 repeated points that are threaded on my pattern shafts. I'm good to go at this point. I can start to fill in pixels to make the picture that will eventually become my lift plan. You can see how the turning points work too. Here's the first one on shaft 1, all the way down to the second one on shaft 19. The program itself fills in the mirrors and repeats. So now I'm free to play to my heart's content. I can make any shape that I want. If I decide I need to remove a square, away it goes. Much easier to deal with than graph paper and mirrors. Time has passed and I've filled up my workspace. Check it out. The bottom half of the piece is complete. Since I want the design to be symmetrical top to bottom, mirrored around a horizontal axis, I could call it quits and just reverse my way out when I'm weaving. But that might cause problems with my borders, so I'd rather include the whole design in my lift plan. Luckily, the program allows me to fill the rest in with a simple copy, paste, and transform command. Voila! It looks just like the piece I'll see while I'm weaving away. But there's one more thing to do. Damask is often woven wrong side up, so most of the warp threads remain on the floor of the shed. This allows for a much happier weaving experience. It's important to make sure the other side, the right side in this case, will look good because I won't be able to see it easily while I'm at the loom. I hit the back button and it shows me the underside of the woven cloth, a blue pattern on a cream background. I like the way it looks, and I'm going to call my design finished. When I'm all done designing, I print out my lift plan, which is what we saw before. Sometimes, if I'm working with a lot of pattern shafts, I print out numbers rather than blank squares. I can number the pull handles on my attachment to match and find that minimizes mistakes when I'm weaving. Let's return to the loom one last time so we can see the lift plan in action. The row that I've just completed is this one here, directly below the yellow post-it. It's the middle of that mullioned window. The dark squares represent shafts 12 through 19, 19 being that left-hand turning point. And you can see that by lifting shafts 12 through 19, I've caused that middle part of the window to be shown in all 4 repeats. Let's see what the next row of the pattern has in store. I move up my post-it and I see that it's pretty much the same, except I'm going to be starting panes again, those white squares which represent dropped shafts. I drop them as required by my lift plan. And everywhere that happens, of course, I will get blue squares when I start to weave again. I will continue following my lift plan, raising and dropping shafts until the entire piece is complete.